David, thanks. State lawmakers today explaining their votes after a bipartisan spending bill failed in the Senate. It would have given more money to public schools and rebate checks to taxpayers. Chief political reporter Jason Zimmerman is in the newsroom after speaking with lawmakers on both sides. Jason.
Cammie, the governor wasted no time after this vote, blasting the opposition, which includes members of his own party, and Republican gubernatorial candidate Tom Tiffany, whose staff reached out to members of the state Senate to express his concerns. The $1.8 billion package included $850 million in direct payments to people living in Wisconsin and $600 million for K-12 education. Another $300 million would go to general school aid meant to help lower property taxes, alongside $50 million for Wisconsin technical colleges. It would also remove state income tax on tips and overtime. After a failed vote in the state Senate, Republicans accused Democrats of playing politics ahead of the November election. While some Democrats criticized the deal, saying they were kept out of the bargaining, and had the bill passed, it would have left the state $2.9 billion in the hole for the next budget process.
There's frustration on all sides that we didn't get something done. My real frustration is that we haven't figured out as a body in Madison that it is better to work together to come up with a compromising solution than to stand on the opposite side of the room and point fingers at one another. And yesterday we tried.
100% down to the election coming up that the Senate Democrats decided, no, actually, because we were touting being bipartisan, working across the aisle all session, now they think that because they're in a position to win the Senate majority, that they feel that they shouldn't have to spend money or give the money back to the people who originally it belongs to.
10 Democrats in the Assembly did vote in favor of this bill, including Ryan Spaulding of Ashwaubenon and Joe Sheehan of Sheboygan. Both won their seats in 2024 in two of the state's closest elections. Cammie, back to you.